7:25 on the morning of June 6, 1944, Sergeant William Millen waded through chest-deep water toward Sword Beach, while German machine gun fire tore through the waves around him, his bagpipes strapped across his back and his worn leather boots already filling with cold seawater. If you're fascinated by the most unconventional warriors of World War II, and the forgotten heroes who defied every rule to survive the deadliest day in modern history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove courage comes in the most unexpected forms. William Millen was born in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, in 1922, but his heart had always belonged to Scotland. His father, a Glasgow policeman who had emigrated during the hard years after the First World War, filled young Bill's childhood with stories of the Highlands, of pipers leading clans into battle, of traditions older than any nation. When the family returned to Scotland in 1928, 6-year-old Bill felt he was finally coming home. He grew up in Glasgow, but every summer his father took him to the Highlands, teaching him to read the land, to feel the difference between solid ground and treacherous bog through the soles of his feet, to move quietly through heather and rock. His father had been a soldier in the Great War and never spoke much about the trenches, but he taught Bill that sometimes the old ways, the simple ways, kept a man alive when all the modern equipment in the world failed. Bill learned the bagpipes at 12. His father insisted on it, said every Scottish boy should know his heritage, should be able to play the instrument that had called their ancestors to battle for centuries. The neighbors complained about the noise echoing through their Glasgow tenement, but Bill practiced every day until his fingers knew the chanter as naturally as his own heartbeat. He was not particularly interested in military glory or romantic notions of war. He simply loved the music, loved the way the pipes could sound mournful and defiant at the same time, could make you want to weep and fight in the same breath. When war came in 1939, Bill was 17. He waited until 1941 to enlist, joining the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, a regiment with a long and bloody history stretching back to 1793. He was assigned as a piper, a ceremonial role mostly, playing at parades and military functions. The bagpipes were officially banned from frontline combat by British military regulations after the First World War, deemed too conspicuous, too likely to draw enemy fire, utterly useless as a weapon. But Bill did not think much about frontline combat then. He was young, the war still felt distant, and he spent his days practicing pipe tunes and learning basic infantry skills. Everything changed in 1943 when he met Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade. Lovat was an aristocrat, tall and handsome, with a theatrical streak and absolute fearlessness that bordered on insanity. He had led commando raids across occupied Europe, had a reputation for eccentric brilliance, and believed deeply in the power of tradition and morale. When Lovat requested a personal piper for his brigade, he specifically asked for someone who could play well and was not afraid to die doing it. Bill Millen was 21 years old, a private who had never seen combat, and he volunteered immediately without fully understanding what he was volunteering for. Lovat looked at him during their first meeting and said, "Can you play the pipes under fire?" Bill, who had never been under fire, said yes. Lovat smiled, a predatory smile that Bill would come to know well, and said, "Good, because I intend to take you to France and you will play us onto the beaches." Bill thought he was joking. Nobody played bagpipes in modern warfare. It was suicide. But Lovat was not joking. Lovat never joked about tradition. The 1st Special Service Brigade trained harder than any unit Bill had ever seen. These were commandos, men selected for intelligence, physical endurance, and a particular brand of controlled aggression. They practiced beach landings, close-quarters combat, demolitions, night raids. Bill trained with them, but his primary role remained the pipes. Some of the men thought it was absurd, a waste of space that could go to another rifleman. Others found it oddly comforting, a connection to something older and more permanent than the war. Bill himself felt increasingly uncertain. He practiced his piping every day, but he also practiced with his rifle, his knife, his grenades. He had a feeling that when the real fighting came, nobody would care about music. His boots became a source of quiet mockery. Standard British military boots were solid, heavy, with thick rubber soles designed for durability. Bill wore a pair of simple leather boots he had bought himself in Glasgow before enlisting. Boots his father had helped him choose. They were lighter, more flexible, with thinner soles that let him feel the ground beneath his feet. His father had told him that in the Highlands you needed to feel the earth to know where it was safe to step, to sense the difference between solid rock and hidden water, between firm soil and soft peat that could swallow you. To Bill, these boots were practical. To the other commandos, they looked like something a farmer would wear to muck out a barn. They called them his farmer boots and laughed that he would probably lose them in the mud on the first day of combat. Bill did not argue. He simply kept wearing them. In early 1944, the training intensified. Everyone knew something massive was coming. The invasion of France, the second front that Stalin had been demanding for years, the operation that would determine whether the Allies could break Hitler's Atlantic Wall or die trying. Bill's brigade was assigned to land on Sword Beach, the easternmost of the 5 invasion beaches, with the mission of pushing inland rapidly to link up with the 6th Airborne Division, which would drop behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. The 6th Airborne's job was to capture and hold 2 critical bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River, codenamed Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge, preventing German reinforcements from counterattacking the beaches. But the paratroopers would be isolated, outnumbered, and under constant attack. If the commandos did not reach them quickly, the airborne troops would be wiped out, and the entire eastern flank of the invasion would collapse. Lord Lovat gathered his officers and senior NCOs, including Bill, and explained the plan. The brigade would land at H-hour plus 90 minutes, after the initial assault waves had supposedly cleared the beach defenses. They would move through the beach, cross a network of flooded fields and German minefields, fight through enemy positions, and reach Pegasus Bridge by 1300 hours. 13 hours after the paratroopers landed. It was 9 miles of enemy-held territory. Lovat estimated they would take 30% casualties. He looked directly at Bill and said, "You will pipe us off the landing craft, you will pipe us across the beach, and you will pipe us all the way to the bridges. The men need to know we are not afraid. The Germans need to know we are coming." Bill said, "Sir, the regulations forbid pipers in combat." Lovat smiled that predatory smile again and said, "Ah, but that is a British Army regulation. You and I are not in the British Army. We are commandos. We do not follow regulations. We follow orders. And I am ordering you to play." Bill lay awake the night before the invasion, thinking about his father, about the Highlands, about the fact that he might die tomorrow doing something absolutely absurd. He thought about the other men in his unit, tough, experienced fighters who had survived commando raids in Norway and North Africa, men who trusted Lovat with their lives. He thought about the paratroopers waiting at Pegasus Bridge, holding on by their fingernails, waiting for relief that might never come. He thought about his boots, his simple leather boots that everyone mocked, and about the fields they would have to cross, the minefields that the Germans had sown across every approach to the bridges. He had heard the intelligence briefings. The Germans had flooded the low ground deliberately, turning the fields into marshes studded with wooden stakes and mines, designed to kill paratroopers on landing and to channel any relief force into pre-sighted killing zones. The mine density was estimated at 1 mine every 2 square meters in some areas. You could not see them under the water. You could only hope your luck held, or that your engineers cleared a path before you stepped on one. Bill thought about his father teaching him to walk through the bogs in the Highlands, teaching him to test the ground with each step, to shift his weight slowly, to feel through the soles of his boots whether the earth beneath was stable or treacherous. He thought about how those thin soles, the ones the other commandos laughed at, let him sense texture and firmness that thicker boots would mask. He wondered if that old skill, that almost forgotten knowledge, would matter at all in a modern minefield. He doubted it. Mines were not bogs. Mines were mechanical, hidden, indifferent to caution. But it was the only edge he had, the only thing that set him apart from the others beyond his absurd pipes and his ridiculous orders to play them under machine gun fire. He did not sleep. At 06:30 hours on June 6, 1944, the landing craft carrying the 1st Special Service Brigade approached Sword Beach. Bill could hear the naval bombardment, the massive guns of the battleships and cruisers hammering the German positions, the roar so loud it felt like the air itself was being torn apart. He could see smoke rising from the beach, fires burning, and as they got closer, he could see bodies floating in the water, wreckage of landing craft and the beach itself, a chaos of exploding shells, machine gun tracers, and men trying to move forward through sand that seemed to erupt with each step. The initial assault waves had not cleared the defenses. The Germans were still very much alive and very much shooting. Lord Lovat stood at the front of the landing craft, calm and immaculate in his uniform, and turned to Bill. "Right, Piper, give them Highland Laddie." Bill stared at him. They were still hundreds of yards offshore. The ramp had not even dropped yet. German artillery was bracketing the landing craft, sending up geysers of water. Men were going to die in the next few minutes, possibly including Bill himself, and Lovat wanted a concert. Bill unslung his pipes, filled the bag, and began to play. The sound cut through the roar of battle, high and piercing and utterly incongruous. Men in the landing craft turned to stare at him, some grinning despite their fear, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The ramp dropped, and Lovett stepped off into chest-deep water, wading toward the beach with bullets snapping through the air around him. Bill followed, still playing, his pipes held high to keep them dry. His farmer boots already soaked and heavy. The water was shockingly cold. The noise was indescribable. Men were screaming, machines were grinding, and above it all, Bill's pipes wailed their ancient defiance. He reached the beach and kept playing, marching up and down the sand while the commandos spread out and began to move inland. He did not understand why he was not hit. Bullets were hitting the sand around him, kicking up little sprays of grit. Mortar rounds were exploding 50 yards away, then 30, then closer. He could see German machine gun positions in the dunes, MG-42s firing in long, ripping bursts that sounded like tearing cloth. He could see British soldiers crouched behind beach obstacles, too scared to move forward, and he walked past them playing "The Road to the Isles." And some of them got up and followed because a man walking upright playing bagpipes could not possibly be more terrifying than staying frozen on that beach. Years later, Bill would learn that German snipers had him in their sights multiple times that morning and chose not to shoot. After the war, a captured German officer told him, "We thought you were insane. We did not shoot you because we believed you must be a madman, and it was bad luck to kill a madman." Bill never knew if that was true or just a story, but it did not matter. He survived the beach. By 800 hours, the brigade had pushed inland, leaving Sword Beach behind, moving toward the flooded fields and the long march to Pegasus Bridge. The landscape was a nightmare. The Germans had flooded the low-lying areas by damming rivers and canals, turning pastures into shallow lakes studded with wooden stakes designed to impale paratroopers. The stakes, called Rommel's asparagus, jutted up through the water at angles, covered with barbed wire and sometimes with mines attached. The paths between the floods were narrow, exposed, and heavily mined. The brigade had engineers with mine detectors, but the detectors were slow and time was critical. The paratroopers at Pegasus Bridge were under increasing pressure. German armor was beginning to probe their positions. If the commandos did not reach them soon, the bridge would fall, and the invasion's eastern flank would collapse. Lord Lovat called a halt at the edge of a flooded field. Intelligence had reported a minefield across the only dry approach to the next village. The engineers moved forward with their detectors, sweeping methodically, marking safe paths with white tape. But after 20 minutes, they had only cleared 50 yards, and they had 300 yards to go. Lovett was pacing, visibly frustrated, checking his watch every few seconds. They were already behind schedule. At this rate, they would not reach Pegasus Bridge until nightfall, far too late. Lovett turned to Bill and said, "Millen, you grew up in the Highlands. You know bogs. Can you read this ground?" Bill looked at the field. It was covered in 6 inches of water, studded with grass tussocks and patches of reeds. The surface looked uniform, But he knew that meant nothing. Mines could be anywhere, hidden just under the water, waiting for weight to trigger them. This was not a highland bog. This was not natural terrain. This was a deliberate killing ground. But he also noticed something. The grass tussocks were not random. Some areas had denser vegetation, which suggested slightly higher, firmer ground. Some areas had sparser growth, which might indicate looser, wetter soil, or ground that had been disturbed recently when the mines were laid. It was a faint pattern, almost invisible, the kind of thing you could only notice if you had spent years learning to read the land. It might mean nothing. It might get them all killed. Bill said, "I can try, sir." Lovett said, "I need more than try. I need 30 men on the other side of this field in the next 15 minutes, or we lose the bridge." Bill took a breath and said, "I will lead them, sir. But they need to follow my exact steps. Single file, no deviation." Lovett nodded and called for volunteers. 30 commandos stepped forward immediately. Experienced men who had survived Norway and Dieppe and a dozen night raids. They looked at Bill's thin leather boots, at his bagpipe still strapped to his back, and some of them smiled grimly. If the piper with the farmer boots was willing to walk point through a minefield, they would follow. Bill stepped into the water. It was murky, cold, just deep enough to hide the ground completely. He moved slowly, testing each step before shifting his weight, feeling through the soles of his boots for firmness, for texture, for the subtle differences that might mean life or death. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Press gently, feel for resistance, trust the earth to tell you what it is." But this was not the earth. This was mud and water and hidden steel. He took another step, aiming for a grass tussock that looked slightly more robust than the others. His boot settled onto firmer ground. He shifted his weight fully onto that foot, then brought his other foot forward, feeling again. Testing again. Behind him, the first commando followed, stepping exactly where Bill had stepped, matching his pace. Then the second, then the third. A line of 30 men moving in silence through the flooded field, each one placing absolute trust in the piper's instincts. Bill's mind emptied of everything except the ground beneath his feet. He stopped thinking about the Germans, about the snipers who might be watching, about the mission, about Pegasus Bridge. He thought only about texture, firmness, resistance. He moved in a weaving pattern, following the slightly higher ground, avoiding areas where the water looked too still, too undisturbed, which might indicate buried obstacles. He did not use the mine detector. He used his boots, his instincts, his childhood training that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with survival in wild places. Twice, he felt something wrong under his boot, subtle softness that made his skin prickle. He froze, redistributed his weight, stepped to the side. Once he heard a faint metallic click behind him, and his heart stopped, but it was just a commando's rifle sling hitting his webbing. The mine had not triggered. They kept moving. The crossing took 12 minutes. Bill reached the far side of the field, climbed up onto dry ground, and turned to watch the last man emerge from the water. 30 men, all alive, not one casualty. The commandos stared at him with something approaching awe. Lord Lovett, who had crossed with the main force using the engineer's cleared path and had arrived 2 minutes after Bill's group, walked up to him and said, "Bloody hell, Millen, how did you do that?" Bill had no answer. He did not know how he had done it. He had simply trusted his boots, trusted the old knowledge his father had given him, and somehow it had been enough. Lovett said, "Right. You are leading every minefield crossing from here to the bridge." For the next 4 hours, Bill led small groups of commandos through 3 more minefields, each time using the same technique, the same slow, methodical testing of the ground through his thin-soled boots. Each time, the men behind him placed their lives in his hands, and each time, they reached the far side alive. Word spread through the brigade. The piper with the farmer boots could sense mines. It was absurd, impossible, but they had seen it. Men who had mocked his boots now asked to be in his group. They trusted him more than they trusted the mine detectors, more than they trusted the engineers with their careful sweeps and white tape. Bill did not feel like a hero. He felt terrified, exhausted, and increasingly certain that his luck would run out. Each minefield was a gamble. Each step was a prayer. He had no special power, no magic ability. He was just a piper who had learned to read bogs as a child, and he was applying that skill to a task it was never designed for, and so far, by some miracle, it was working. At 12:58 hours, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, the 1st Special Service Brigade reached Pegasus Bridge. The bridge was battered, pocked with bullet holes and scorch marks, surrounded by dead Germans and a few dead British paratroopers. The men of the 6th Airborne Division, exhausted and low on ammunition, stared in disbelief as Lord Lovett's commandos marched up the road, and at the front, playing blue bonnets over the border, was a piper in a green beret and worn leather boots. Major John Howard, the airborne officer who had led the initial glider assault to capture the bridge in the early hours of the morning, shook Lovett's hand and said, "You are exactly on time. We had almost given up hope." Lovett smiled and gestured to Bill. "Thank this man. He walked us through every minefield between here and the beach." Howard looked at Bill, at his bagpipes, at his muddy farmer boots, and said, "Christ, they will never believe this back in England." The fighting was not over. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly over the next 3 days. Bill continued to play his pipes during the worst moments, walking through mortar fire and sniper fire, and somehow, impossibly, he was never hit. Men around him died, but Bill kept playing, kept leading patrols, kept walking through minefields with his thin-soled boots and his absurd trust in the ground beneath his feet. On June 9th, a German sniper finally shot the bag of his pipes, deflating them mid-tune. Bill stared at the ruined instrument, felt the air hissing out, and realized how close the bullet had come to his chest. That night, he sat alone in a shell crater, shaking, unable to stop thinking about all the moments he should have died, all the times a bullet or a shell or a mine should have ended him. He thought about the men who had followed him through the minefields, the men who had trusted him, and he wondered how many of them would have died if he had stepped wrong just once. He did not play the pipes again for 3 days, not because they were broken, but because he could not make himself pick them up. The weight of survival, the guilt of being alive when so many others were dead, pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. But on June 12th, Lord Lovett found him and said, "The men are asking for you. They need to hear the pipes. They need to know we are still Scottish, still human, still more than just killers." Bill repaired his pipes with tape and canvas and played that evening as the sun set over Normandy. He played "The Green Hills of Tyrol," a slow, mournful tune, and men wept openly as they listened. The brigade pushed deeper into France, fighting through the brutal bocage country, the hedgerows and sunken lanes where every field was a fortress and every advance was paid for in blood. Bill continued to serve as Lovett's piper, but he also served as a scout, leading patrols through terrain that others considered impassable. His ability to read ground, to sense safe paths through minefields and bogs, became legendary within the brigade. Men requested him for dangerous missions, believing that if Millen was leading, they would come back alive. Bill did not feel legendary. He felt exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly disconnected from the young man who had volunteered for this war. He had killed Germans, had shot men at close range, had used his knife in the dark. He had done things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he had also saved lives, had led men to safety when death seemed certain, and that became the thing he held on to, the only thing that made any of it bearable. In August 1944, Lord Lovat was seriously wounded by a shell burst and evacuated to England. The brigade continued fighting, but without Lovett's eccentric leadership, Bill's role as piper diminished. He was reassigned to standard infantry duties fighting through Belgium and into Germany. He never led another patrol through a minefield. The war ended in May 1945, and Bill returned to Scotland, 23 years old, with no physical wounds but carrying memories that would never fade. He tried to return to civilian life, working odd jobs, playing the pipes at weddings and Highland games. He married, had children, and never spoke much about the war. When people asked, he would mention Normandy, mention the pipes, but he never told them about the minefields, about the impossible crossings, about the 30 men who trusted him with their lives and survived because of his farmer boots and his childhood training in the Highlands. For decades, his story remained largely unknown outside of commando circles. Lord Lovat mentioned him in his memoirs, but the focus was always on Lovat himself, on the aristocratic commander who led his men with a piper by his side. Bill was a footnote, a colorful detail in someone else's narrative. It was not until the 1970s, when historians began interviewing D-Day veterans more systematically, that Bill's story began to emerge. A researcher tracking down every member of the 1st Special Service Brigade found Bill living quietly in Dawlish, Devon, working as a mental health nurse. The researcher asked him about the beach landing, about playing the pipes under fire, and Bill answered briefly, factually, without emotion. But when the researcher asked about the minefields, Bill's demeanor changed. He became animated, almost defensive, insisting that it was not bravery, not heroism, just a skill he happened to have. A skill that mattered for a few hours on a few terrible days, and then never mattered again. The researcher pressed for details, and slowly, Bill told the story. He described the flooded fields, the pressure of leading men through hidden death, the weight of responsibility, the certainty that he would eventually step wrong and take everyone with him. He described his boots, the thin leather boots that let him feel the ground, and how the other commandos had mocked them until they became the thing that saved lives. He described the silence of those crossings, the absolute focus, the way time seemed to stop and the world narrowed to the texture of mud under his soles. The researcher published an article about Bill in a military history journal in 1976. A few more articles followed. In 1994, for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Bill was invited to Normandy for the commemoration ceremonies. He played his pipes at Pegasus Bridge, the same pipes he had carried in 1944, now old and battered, and veterans of the 6th Airborne Division came up to him and thanked him, told him they remembered hearing the pipes that day, remembered the piper leading the commandos up the road, remembered feeling relief flood through them, because if the piper was alive and playing, they were going to survive. Bill died in 2010 at the age of 88. His obituary in the Times called him the piper who played Britain onto the beaches of Normandy, but it barely mentioned the minefields, barely acknowledged the quiet heroism of those crossings, the skill and courage required to lead men through hidden death, with nothing but instinct and worn-out boots. Today, a few military historians know his full story. There is a small display about him at the Pegasus Bridge Museum, featuring his pipes and a photograph of him on D-Day, young and intense, standing in the surf with his instruments held high. But most people who visit the museum walk past it without pausing, drawn instead to the tanks and the gliders and the dramatic narrative of the airborne assault. Bill Millen was not a famous general or a decorated hero. He did not win the Victoria Cross or command armies. He was a young man who played an obsolete instrument in a modern war, who wore simple boots that others mocked, and who discovered that old knowledge, old skills could still save lives even in the most mechanized and brutal conflict in human history. He led 30 men through a minefield without losing one, not because he was fearless, but because he was willing to trust something his father had taught him as a child, something that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with survival. He proved that in the chaos of D-Day, in the hell of Normandy, a man with courage, skill, and farmer boots could still make a difference. War reduces individuals to numbers, to casualty statistics, to pins on a map. History remembers the generals and the pivotal battles, but it forgets the piper who walked point through 4 minefields in a single day, who played music under machine gun fire, who saved lives in ways that cannot be quantified or decorated. Bill Millen's story reminds us that behind every statistic, every number in every history book, there were real people making impossible choices, using whatever skills they had, however absurd or inadequate those skills seemed, to bring their comrades home alive. They deserve to be remembered, not as legends or myths, but as human beings who were terrified and exhausted and traumatized, and who did extraordinary things anyway because someone had to, and they were there. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes of World War II, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and if someone in your family served in any war. Their stories deserve to be remembered too, the small moments of courage and skill that never made it into the history books, but that mattered desperately to the people who lived them.